Brilliant. Thank you for a very warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be invited to speak to you here today. I think this talk is going to address a few of the issues that have already been mentioned. Many thanks. Firstly, following on from Adam's talk, I'm going to be contextualising open access publishing in the humanities. I'm actually going to be taking a slightly different approach. I'm not going to talk so much about the transparency agenda, although of course it's very important. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about a kind of do-it-yourself DIY culture, and specifically positioning some of the opportunities we could learn from in terms of hacker culture, hacking tech, sort of getting on with it, whilst the landscape is shifting and changing. I would also like to pick up on Lars' point earlier on about academic responsibility. I am here speaking to you today as primarily an academic. I'm a lecturer in modern contemporary literature. And I think it's really essential that academics do take on this responsibility. We have a key role to play amongst a variety of stakeholders. And whilst it might be fair to say that academics have been left out of these debates to a certain extent, I think with our project we're demonstrating that there's actually an increasing awareness amongst the academic community in the humanities of what we need to do ourselves, what we can actually get on and achieve. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this context. I'm going to address funding issues and business models. And then I'd like to finish up with a question about international challenges. So just before I start, in case you don't know or you haven't heard of us, the Open Library of Humanities is an academic-led, not-for-profit, mega-journal and monograph publishing pilot scheme. We are borrowing from the model of a mega journal like PLOS ONE, but there are key distinctions to be made in that obviously in the humanities the question of scale is going to be slightly different. We are advocating rigorous peer review from the start. We can address that perhaps in a few years' time, but it's a very delicate issue in the humanities, so we're going to be launching with kind of legitimate, prestigious and rigorously peer-reviewed articles. And the other key distinction to be made is that we are aiming to launch without any article processing charges. This is absolutely essential to us. This is why we started up this project. Having worked both inside Russell Group universities as well as post-92 institutions, I'm only too aware of the pressures that librarians face, that research budgets face, that academic researchers themselves face. And that is why we are looking to build an alternative business model around library consortia. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, so just to start off with then, I wanted to think about definitions of open access. I was interested just to pick up again on the Budapest Open Access Initiative statement, because I think it has a couple of things that are very important to remind ourselves. Firstly then, that in the statement, we're talking here not just about journal articles, we're also talking about a category which, and I quote, encompasses peer-reviewed journal articles, but also includes any unreviewed preprints that might be academics might wish to put online for comment. Obviously, we're also talking about machine access to materials and the question of being able to index and crawl kind of, these kinds of materials. This idea of preprints is something that I wish to explore in a little bit of detail here, because I think that humanities scholars have quite a bit to learn in some senses from the core STEM subjects, whereas we've seen open access has been developing perhaps for a slightly longer period. Going around talking to academic colleagues in the humanities disciplines, I'm often faced with the question of, don't we have a distinct culture? We're not curing cancer. Do we need to have immediate access to our materials? And these kinds of questions. And I suppose my response would be that actually sharing and collaborating on research makes research stronger. I fundamentally believe that. So I'm thinking through with my co-director Martin Eve at the Open Library of Humanities, we're thinking through ways in which we can draw on some of the lessons from the sciences. So I'm just going to touch upon these as it's mentioned in my abstract, but I'm not going to spend too much time, and this is obviously a brief kind of overview, if you like. So hacker culture then, what do I mean by this? You can trace this history of hacking back to MIT University in the early 1960s, There's a sense of a greater access to shared computers, an opening up of research collaborations amongst other scientists, other academics, librarians, and interested parties. And this changes the nature of peer review. It allows academics to closely examine, to modify, to rework each other's articles. And hackers then extended this through the creation of legal licenses. So rethinking ideas about copyright, who holds the copyright to various software programs. And we can see that a little bit later on developed by Richard Stallman, who's a key figure in this kind of hacker history as it's been theorized, who worked at the Artificial Information Lab at MIT and was a key part of this software sharing community. I wanted to also mention Archive here. It's been mentioned a little bit earlier on. Founded in 1991 by Paul Ginsberg, as you can see on the bottom right picture there. This repository then is sort of in the core STEM subjects, preprints in maths, physics, astronomy, computer science, circulating papers prior to publication. Now, after email and the internet, this has been able to expand on quite a large scale. I believe they receive several thousand articles each month. But I think what I find interesting is that actually prior to that, this builds on a kind of long scholarly tradition of sharing research in the sciences where papers were sort of printed off, Xeroxed and posted to academic researchers. So it's not exclusively about the internet. It's much more building on that kind of culture of sharing, if you like. I wanted to think about the way in which a project like Archive, which now obviously printing preprints is a very core part of academic research and dissemination of green open access materials in the sciences, how we might be able to adopt and borrow and rework some of those principles within humanities scholarship in a different kind of climate. I was just going to mention one case study, because it's a journal that I set up and I run with Martin Eve from the OLH called Alluvium. This isn't the only example to choose, but the reason that I think it's quite interesting is because we decided to set up what is effectively a kind of publisher run through WordPress rather than the OJS software. So it's set up on a kind of WordPress template. We publish new articles. Every 2 months, we publish 4 lead articles in 21st century approaches to literature. And as it's sort of developed, we launched in June 2012. There's a sort of evolution taking place. And this is distinctly amongst younger and early career researchers who are mostly publishing in this format, although we do have some senior distinguished colleagues publishing here. And through kind of feedback from the authors and trying to gauge a sense of how this is developing from an editorial perspective, I found it really interesting that scholars are writing new pieces of research in a short form. So Alluvium publishes articles that are about 2,000 words in length that are completely open access on the internet. And that then through the kind of feedback loop, through the process of comments that we have on the website, scholars are then able to kind of build on those articles, and then they work them up and submit them to the traditional journal publishers. And those would be your sort of refable, perhaps, articles. So in that sense, I'd like to suggest that Alluvium is functioning as a kind of repository of preprints in the humanities. Another example would be Flow TV, which is a similar WordPress-run journal at the University of Texas in Austin, and that publishes materials in film, new media, and TV scholarship. So I think, albeit on a small scale, these examples are very important in signalling the way in which humanities scholarship can actually learn and borrow from the sciences. Now, I was going to try and get onto the internet just very briefly to show you something else while I'm here. So another way in which we can perhaps learn from a kind of hacker culture, a sort of model of gift culture, which I'm suggesting academic scholarship since the early scholarly societies in the late 17th century has been premised upon this idea of a gift culture, the fact that we're privileged as scholars to be able to give away our own research for free to the community. We don't need to earn a salary from it, in the actual publication itself, hopefully if we're tenured. In that sense, we're quite different from creative practitioners like filmmakers, artists, musicians, and so on. This idea of gift culture, then, And I think it addresses some of the questions that have been raised today about forming larger groups, third parties, where we can bring together, I think Michael referred to a kind of ad hoc flourishing at the moment. It's a very exciting time to be working in open access publishing, but there are lots of projects sort of popping up all the time. And at the Open Library of Humanities, we realised that we do need to be sharing resources in terms of saving costs, being more efficient, networking amongst other publishing projects, demonstrating to various different constituents that we can work together, albeit with a healthy sense of sort of competition. And with all of that in mind, we set up the Open Access Toolset Alliance. Various different groups are working on this project, including people who work at PLOS, the Public Knowledge Project, the University of Heidelberg, people working at eLife. So various of the large sort of open access publishers are coming on board. And this tool set is to develop specific components of tech which can be shared. So, for example, Martin Eve, who is coordinating it, who is my co-director at the OLH, is working on a citation parser that can be under the open source license, can then be shared for various different open access publishing projects. And in that sense, we're working closely, for example, with the product development team at PLOS, and sort of finding ways in which we can, various different people can use their kind of funded research to help one another. So I thought I'd mention that as a sort of example of the way in which we can share resources. Please do go and have a look at the website. If you're interested, you can get in touch with us. Okay. So I'd like to turn now then to the crucial question of economics, business models and funding. Obviously, this is uppermost in all of our minds at the moment, and with the the recommendations that in the future funding is going to be increasingly hard to come by, I think this is something we all have to take very seriously. I just wanted to sort of draw our attention back to the point that John Walensky makes, that open access is not the same thing as free access. The open access movement, then, he says, is not operating in denial of economic realities. Rather, it is concerned with increasing access to more of the research libraries for more people, with that increase measured over what is currently available in print and electronic formats. That's a very crucial point. There are obviously costs attached to setting up journals, to staffing, to finding skilled staff to come and work for you, to digital repositories, safe archiving, memberships and subscription services to things like clocks, locks, to DOI assignment, and so on. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. So there are different ways in which you could try and fund an open access journal, and I think this addresses the question of scale. So Alluvium, as I just showed you, is an example of perhaps a very small-scale journal, similar to many postgraduate journals that are run on the OJS system, which generally are supported in university library and IT budgets with a minimal sort of IT support. They are run on free labour from postgrads and academics. Obviously, peer review is frequently carried out for free by academics, so that builds on that kind of gift culture anyway. So at a small scale, we can have a lot of these OJS or WordPress-led journals, and they're a wonderful thing. But I suppose the question becomes, how do we scale up? It is important that we're able to go to particular places and find large volumes of information and be able to kind of crawl those with our machines as well as search them as researchers. Another option is advertising revenue. It's not one that we favour at the OLH, but that might be a possible model. It raises various contradictions about who you might choose as your advertisers, but I'm sure some people, no doubt, will be exploring that idea. Then we come down to the article processing charge, or the author pays model, the APC. Clearly, this is the way that a lot of the commercial academic publishers are moving, and it's very encouraging that APCs have come down with some publishers in the first year or so, but I suppose as an academic, I have a certain reserved scepticism about how long those charges can remain at an affordable level, and I really don't think on the scale of the research budgets currently at universities that we can move forwards with APCs. I think we have to try and think about more creative solutions, perhaps. There are also, for me, questions about the outsourcing of various parts of the production process in publication, things like typesetting and so on, where the labour is shifted, around the world, for example, down to East Asia and so on. And as an academic, I find that perhaps something that needs to be raised and thought about. And then finally, the question of the library consortia. I thought Lars's talk actually was great in this respect. A question of reallocating resources to improve efficiency, to think about consortia models beyond individual institutions at the level of networks that are national and or international, and how we might support this transition to open access. These are the areas in which the OLH is campaigning at the moment, is talking about. We have what we're calling a library partnership subsidy model, LPS, the Library Partnership Subsidy. We're currently, as a project, we're in the process of getting seed funding for 12 months to build up our business model of the Library Partnership Subsidy, which involves developing consortia agreements with various library networks. We're not the only open access publisher to be exploring this model of funding. Knowledge Unlatched, who I mentioned a moment ago, are also looking at this, and we're working with Knowledge Unlatched. Lucy Montgomery is on one of our committees. However, they're focusing more on the monograph publishing side, and we're looking at the journal publishing side. The idea with the LPS model would be that after we have launched with a certain amount of private funding, we could build up enough libraries to join our scheme that we would be able to see these library partnership subsidies come down to about £200 or maybe £300 annually. We think that's a very reasonable model to try and invest in open access publishing. We're not just publishing new material at the OLH. We've been approached by a number of scholarly societies, a number of pre-existing journals, some of whom are slightly vulnerable, concerned about digital preservation issues, others of whom are looking to transfer from their various contracts and come across to our platform. So we will be a new publisher of gold open access material, as well as a kind of repository for various different journals who can maintain that niche kind of branding and be sort of co-branded with us. There are questions about the free rider problem. Are there libraries who wouldn't want to pay to subscribe when they can get the material for free? But recently, Knowledge Unlatched and GISC Collections have done quite an extensive set of data collection on this around Europe, and they've discovered that actually that's not as much of a problem as everyone thought. So we're hoping that that's a good way to proceed. Okay, so I said I'd talk a little bit about international challenges. I think this is really essential. As Peter Suber says in his book Open Access, if you haven't already read it, I thoroughly encourage you to do so. It's a very useful text. The motivation for open access is partly to help solve a problem of access gaps, that these are radically asymmetrical around the world. To give you a couple of figures, in 2008, this is the number of subscriptions that different institutions were able to afford. Harvard, at the top, was able to afford 98,900 serial subscriptions. At Yale, it was just over 73,000. And then the Indian Institute of Science, which is the largest body in India, it was 10,600. So just to kind of raise that level of the inequalities of funding and access to traditional subscription journals around the world. The point that open access isn't universal access needs to be taken seriously. There are still barriers which include the following three things primarily. We still have censorship in some areas and methods of filtering. We still have language barriers, the problem that English is the lingua franca for much publication in the scholarly world. Also the question that machine translation still remains quite weak in some areas. And handicap access barriers, as well as barriers of connectivity, the digital divide. I wanted to just speak briefly around a case study of African libraries and to raise your awareness that actually open access is booming in other parts of the world, but part of the problem is that this doesn't always get picked up by us. As Jagadish Beheri has recently written in an article on this subject about the open access boom in developing nations, he got his figures from the DOAJ. He said that the UK has 586 open access journals at this time in 2013 when he published. Spain, it was 465. Germany, 286. Brazil, it was 843, which was second only to the United States. India and Egypt were also very significant. So actually, Brazil, India, Egypt, places outside of Europe have far more open access journals. They are already publishing. Obviously, there's huge benefits to open access research in these countries. But part of the problem is that they don't always get picked up by the databases, the scientific databases like PubMed, for example. And so, academics, perhaps in North America and Europe, aren't aware of these publications. So some of the people on our committees then, the Open Library of Humanities is a very international project. We have a committee dedicated to questions of internationalization, which includes access for scholars from around the world. We're working with Spark Japan to help raise awareness to Japanese publications. We aren't just looking to publish in English, we'll have non-English language publications also. We have a number of people on our committees, as I said, working in Africa. Haditi, for example, who are raising awareness of kind of open access and research. They recently partnered with the Digital Public Library of America, the DPLA. Also colleagues from the African Digital Library and Support Network, and the International Conference of African Digital Libraries and Archives. And if I can just quote to you from their website, initiatives for digital libraries and archives are well established in most countries in the global north, but in Africa these are lagging behind, and in the main are in embryonic stages, limited and not well coordinated. There is widespread scarcity of expertise and resources to manage digital infrastructure and information. So we wanted to recognise these challenges that colleagues working in information management, sort of digital preservation, as well as academic researchers around the world are facing. And so that is a core part of what we're trying to achieve. So just to finish up then, if I may, sorry? You may. I may, thank you. It's always nice to be told I may. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Open Library of Humanities, and apologies if this has come across slightly briefly. I mentioned at the start of my talk, this is a mega journal project and a monograph pilot. If I could just explain why we're trying to do both, because that might seem very ambitious to you. There is a real problem of prestige in the humanities scholarship. There's a kind of perception that open access publishing on online-only journals, platforms isn't quite as legitimate and isn't quite as reputable and might not necessarily count for the ref in the UK or might not count for tenure hiring committees in America or elsewhere. So we decided we need to address this head-on, and for that reason, if you want to go and look at our website, you can drop down the committees tab up there. On our various committees, we have tried to invite the most high-profile colleagues that we can. Individuals who work for some key organisations, including UNESCO, the Public Library of Science, the Wellcome Trust, JISC Collections, the OAPEN Foundation, the Creative Commons, colleagues who work at the Modern Languages Association in North America, which is the largest scholarly association in literature, professors working at Harvard, Stanford, publishers working at MIT Press, colleagues working at the Institute of Humanities Research, the Public Knowledge Project, and colleagues at the British Academy. We have very deliberately tried to get the agreement and the support of these individuals to signal for a new project to enter into this landscape that we are a prestigious academic-led organisation. The other thing that we've tried to do, coming back to the point about monographs then, is we're partnering up with 4 very prestigious, internationally known publishers, 3 of whom are university presses and 1 of whom is a born digital publisher. And there's a strand of our project which will be a pilot in publishing monographs. We're doing this to try and get transparent data about costings, how much it actually realistically costs to produce a scholarly monograph from start to finish. We then will be publishing that data once it's available, and we have to have agreements from our partners in an open access journal so everyone can see it. And it occurred to us that actually if we can get these high-profile university presses to be working with us as our partners in the monograph sphere, that will help confer prestige in the journals area. So our mega journal, which is a frightening word for many humanities academics, will seem kind of more scholarly, more traditional. And at the same time, we can funnel money across from our library partnership scheme to help support the monographs. As I'm sure many of you are no doubt aware, monograph publishing faces huge challenges over the coming years, and the transition to open access is not going to be easy. But we felt, as humanities researchers, we want to signal that we really value monographs as a form of publication. There are exciting things we can do with them. We can open them up. They don't in future we can have sort of more hyperlinks and pathways through a monograph, but we would like to explore those costs. And just to finish then, we've been expanding our editorial network. It is a fairly global network. We have section editors already signed up, working from around the world: China, Taiwan, North America, Latin America, Europe, Australia, and so on. We're including humanities as a kind of broad term that would cover things like theology, history, literature, modern languages, philosophy. It also edges into the social sciences. We have section editors and pledged articles to be published already in legal theory, media theory, political science, digital humanities. So we're taking a fairly broad understanding of humanities, although we're not technically called HSS. And we're taking questions of tech, questions of bringing down costs, not just for our project, but for other open access publishing projects very seriously. We think that's essential when funding is very hard to come by. We take digital preservation very seriously, and we see part of our role as to help protect vulnerable journals and small-scale journals who can move onto our platform. So I just wanted to sort of finish really with the message that I started with, the idea of gift culture, the idea of kind of a DIY inheritance of a model from the sciences is really a vital part of what we're doing. I do think that academics can perform a really positive role in this landscape where obviously policy implementations are contested and sometimes slower moving than we prefer. There is a positive role for academics to be working in partnership with publishers, commercial publishers, and with librarians as well. So please, if you're interested, do go and check out the website and get in touch with us. Thank you very much.